sorry.
This is
Forgot
only
I mentioned
NYU.
that you have any other affiliation, except that I think it is evidence of the many places where her thinking about data is really respected and valued and influential. So it's a great pleasure to have her here to hear about making data great again.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. It's been a delight to be here over the past few days and listen to people. Helen, you're not meant to eat in here.
And this is recorded.
Never run for office.
Does not obey rules.
This will come back to haunt you.
There's plenty in this room that will come back to haunt.
Hopefully not.
And so, yeah, it's really been fascinating listening to the conversations and getting many of the ideas that you have put forward. I'm delighted. I actually helped to partially fund that Bertinoro conference back in the day, Adam remembers, and was there, and to watch a field flower the way this has flowered has been terrific. It's really interesting and useful. So what I hope that you take away from the discussion that I'm going to have today is what I'd like to do is to have the considerable brain power in this room think about how to address maybe questions that I think are more important. Okay, privacy, however defined, information, whatever, is incredibly valuable. And what I'd like to kind of get you to think about is the kinds of questions that I've been facing, and I think the country is facing, not just this country, but other countries, up close and personal, okay? So this is going to be, I should have entitled this A View from the Trenches, not from Valhalla, not that you're dead yet, but you will be soon, Helen. But women can't go to Valhalla. So as I was going through this and as I was thinking about this, and I'm going to apologize to Adam as my discussant, because of course I did change things and you haven't seen the changes, but that's okay. So it occurred to me that really the title is wrong. It's not making data great again, it's making measurement great again. So I want to talk through why measurement is so important. So clearly where I'm going to head is a discussion of risk and utility associated with that measurement, and why why the particular use cases that I'm going to be talking about, I hope you hold dear to your heart when you're writing down the abstract descriptions that you have done so beautifully over the past few days. So I'm an academic, so I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, and then I'm going to tell you what I told you, right? So obviously, we've got massive types of new data that have completely, fundamentally changed the way in which we can do research for the public good. And also, as you guys have pointed out, there's a downside risk associated with that. So, but I'm going to focus on the good side because that's what I care about. So what that means is, because you guys have to focus in on the bad side, I think there are three issues that I'd like this community to be thinking about. The critical role of access for measurement. I'm going to spell out what that means more. Something that Frauke has highlighted, and Helen and others, the link between utility, risk, and the trade-off between the two, and understanding what that trade-off is. And Kobe gave me a fisheye earlier this week when I said, think about protecting output more than inputs. So I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking of, and then you can tell me how stupid I am, but that's okay. My husband does that all the time, and we're still married. And I think it's what I'm going to pose to you is, I hope I'll convince you, since you're all high-functioning academics, that this is an important but very difficult research agenda. So what I'm hoping to hear from you at the end is, you know, when you talk to some people, they'll say, oh, but that's really hard. And what I'm hoping that you'll say is, oh, that's really hard, right? So here's where we're going to go. So here's the new types of data. So I think that the type of data that you've been largely thinking about is data generated by surveys, which are nicely curated, documented, collected rows and columns, where the measures have been thought about for a long time, and someone in a federal statistical agency has said, this is how we're going to measure it, and here it comes. You may also have been thinking about administrative data, but typically just one-offs like tax records or unemployment insurance wage records. Where social scientists like me and life scientists, lots of other areas in which we think about confidential data, data that are also collected in a variety of different ways that may not be rows and columns. So this is Charlie Catlett's work at the University of Chicago, where he has the sensors that are capturing information every 10 seconds about particulate quality and lots of other things. These are colleagues at NYU. For those of you who've been in New York, the number one complaint is noise, right? Which is ephemeral, hard to measure, and they've been using sensors to capture the information on noise, which of course includes conversations. Hello, darling, my husband's off tonight, come on over, right? So that's captured. Not that those words would ever come out of my lips, as I said. But, you know, capturing that information, it's got a very different structure, right? Retail scanners, DNA information, all of those don't come in nice, tidy rows and columns. And so, and a lot of the administrative data, about which I'm going to talk a lot now, don't come in a prepackaged, nicely documented, pre-measured format. So I'm originally from New Zealand. This was not a New York accent. And so I'm going to give you some kind of foreshadow some of the work that was done in New Zealand and give you some sense of the value of having and combining data from multiple sources and give you a sense of the challenges that are associated. So New Zealand, like any other government, kind of has the major buckets of spending are education, health, pension. And what we did in the 2000-2001 was start to build an integrated data infrastructure. So what that means is when you're looking at spending, people touch programs, government programs, in many different ways. And if you're trying to allocate resources in a government program, what you're interested in doing is capturing all the different ways in which they might be touched so that you can figure out, get a better handle on how to best deliver services. Both for the benefit of the individual, remember I'm talking about the public good here, and for the benefit of the public purse. So here's an example. So this kid is born, and you can look at data from administrative records from Children, Youth, Family Services, and you'll see around age 2.5 the kid starts touching Children, Youth, Family Services, and there's findings of abuse. At age 5, they start into the education system. By age 9 or 10, the attendance in the education system is spotty. And you can see the cumulative amount of cost that's coming up across these different agencies. By age 12 or 13, showing up with abuse, taken into foster care here, gaps in education. They're not showing up to school. And then in and out of care. Then come about 17, they're showing up in youth justice. About 18, they're showing up in income support. And there's the cumulative cost that's coming up. So you can put those pieces together and, look at the likelihood of a kid achieving a school certificate, the equivalent of a high school certificate by age 18. And if obviously your risk of spiraling down is very much increased if you don't get that school certificate. And if you take a look at the risk factors, now with all the decisions and issues associated with those risk factors, you've got the clearly low risk kids. Most of those are going to get the school certificate, and a bunch of high risk kids. And really, when you think about allocating resources, what you really want to do is provide one-on-one interventions with those kids to help them get the education qualifications.
So can I ask where those risk numbers come from?
So they're figured out from the school systems. You've linked all the data from the integrated data infrastructure. You figure out whether or not a kid is going to get the education certificate, and then you model that. So one of the things with the IDI is that we started it, we were building the LEHD in the United States, and so I spent a couple of weeks 3 times a year for 2 years in New Zealand, and we started to build the basis for an integrated data infrastructure. And then we got lots of agencies to share their data. And now, within government agencies, any policy that is developed, they look at the IDI to model the risks and the benefits associated with any type of intervention. Now, the models may or may not be good. Those risks may or not be correct, but that's the kind of analysis that's able to be done. And it's even, and you're going to hear about why I care about doing those links correctly and doing those models correctly and getting lots of eyes on those data. Right? So you're actually I think you're setting me up perfectly. So why is that happening? Well, obviously, part of the reason is to increase the chance of the children getting education, keeping them out of abuse. Also, it substantially reduces the cost to the taxpayer. And of course, the costs are attributable to clients who enter the benefit system under age 20. And the data on these requires linking data across agency lines, and it requires measurement. It requires people within the agencies and the research community, so this is in partnership with social science researchers, making some decisions about how to measure things. Okay? Could be wrong, right? So there's a new opportunity in the United States, and this is the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy. And the reason I'd put that in there is they talk about data in the center. They also talk about privacy, rigor, capacity, humility, and transparency. And so this is how I got kind of pulled into into a lot of the discussion at the federal level was that when the commission was established by Paul Ryan and Patty Murray, OMB gave funds to Census to inform the decision-making of the commission. And one of those things was we have to be able to put those administrative records together. So just like the IDI, which started in New Zealand 2000-2001, now they're really thinking about building an integrated data infrastructure in the United States. They call it an administrative data clearinghouse. So Census asked me and my colleagues at University of Maryland and University of Chicago to think through what might that clearinghouse look like. Well, I don't like the term clearinghouse, so we changed it to a facility. And they were thinking about a technical environment whereby data could be put together. And I'd served as the chair of the IT committee for when they set up the Administrative Data Research Network in the United Kingdom. And one of the things that was very interesting about that is in the UK, they'd recognized the same thing a few years earlier. ESRC had spent £38 million, about $50 million, to build an administrative data research network, and so that agencies would put their data in. What a shock. Agencies didn't, right? So why didn't they? Lots of different reasons. One is bad data, bad analysis, bad documentation, no upside risk, just downside risk. And so what we decided to do is it was critical to build the capacity in the government agencies to work with their data, lest, data get integrated in a bad way, or bad decisions get made, or measurement errors creep in, and so on. So that's what we did. We jointly built this administrative data research facility and combined it with a set of applied data analytics training programs to train the government agency staff how to work with the data. Okay?
Question?
Yep.
Is there a legal framework allowing the sharing of data or putting data together from different government agencies?
Is there a legal framework? Is there a legal framework? So that's a great question. Of course, any data that are to be combined have to essentially. There's 5 different buckets that every agency has to think about. They have different legislation, and that needs to be reconciled. But it's essentially safe people. It has to be approved people. It has to be safe projects, approved projects. It has to be a safe setting, demonstrably safe setting. Safe data, so ideally de-identified, not clearly anonymized data. And safe outputs, okay? So with every agreement that was put together, that was the core focus of the agreements between the legal entities of the government agencies. So absolutely, you can't. That's why the notion of a clearinghouse is a non-starter. It's got to be for approved purpose, approved people, and so on. Notion that you're just going to shove data in and you're going to play it is just not going to happen. And I'm going to argue that this, people worry obviously about privacy, but I'm going to argue that it's absolutely critical to do something like this. So there's a great quote from Leanna Wen. Baltimore's a very violent city, as you're probably aware. And as she says, every time a kid dies in Baltimore, the commissioners of all the agencies that they touch, so in the example in New Zealand, Children, Youth, Family Services, Education, foster care, criminal justice, income support, they'd all get together and figure out what did they do wrong and how could they improve for the future. But the only time they get together is when the kid's dead. Right? So that happens in the United States as well. So many of you will be familiar with the 5-year-old kid who died a couple of weeks ago. And what kind of happened was the police went, saw the kid had a bruise on the right hip. Family services had been involved since he was born. So the welfare system had been in. There'd been 40 different contacts from different agencies on the kid. He told the doctor. Doctor wasn't allowed to share the information for privacy reasons. And that's a kid who died. Right? So you know, the challenge is, of course, that when we're trying to put data together, so this is an abstract little X's and Y's. These are kids, right? So the problem is that when you're putting the data together, the data are messy and dirty, as you just pointed out. They're not nicely curated. So here's an example when we were running the class. So we brought together data from different agencies. So the question, going back to the authorized purpose, the authorized question was, what is the impact of access to jobs and neighborhood characteristics on the earnings and employment outcomes of ex-offenders and welfare recipients and their subsequent recidivism and retention on welfare? So we had people in the classes from city, county, state, federal governments, and they're working with microdata on corrections, ex-offenders, on welfare recipients, on labour markets, on housing, and they're trying to answer that question in teams. Because no one knows, the people in corrections don't know the data on labour, the people in labour don't know the data on TANF, they don't know the housing. Some people know how to code, others know the data. Some people know how to structure a question and produce results that make sense because they're at the coalface. They understand what measures are going to have value to answer the questions that are going to inform policy. So here's an example. Here they are working with it. And these are data that have actually been curated. They've got a data dictionary. And here is Eleanor. She's working on it. Hi, DOC, Department of Corrections Data Gurus. Why am I getting junk here? And this is on Slack. And the CIO says, it's bad data. Ignore it. Now, without having people working together, looking at that measurement, you could have had bad analysis, or you could have spent 20 days or months trying to call the person to figure out what's going on, and they wouldn't have returned your calls, right? And then here's someone else in the class saying, actually this is Clayton, who's saying, here's some code that could be useful. So we're going to share code. And then someone else from Connecticut who's saying, oh, here's a sample that's going to help you do your job. And here's someone else, Rick Hendra from MDRC, who's saying, here's an article that's going to help you understand the context. So the point here is that back when we were dealing with survey data of rows and columns, which were nicely, the questions and the measurements had been predetermined and discussed, we got the data set handed to us on a silver platter by trained statisticians and survey scientists, so we had a data set. The point here is the data come at the end of the process, not at the beginning, okay? So, and there's lots of things that get found out. So for example, you think about one of the outcomes that they were interested in is, did an ex-offender get a job? Well, what's a job? Many jobs are fleeting, last less than a quarter. About 25% of all jobs last less than a quarter. So one of the teams started to put together a picture of the ex-offenders because they were able to link the ex-offender data with the employment records, and they were able to see that only 3% of the ex-offenders had jobs that lasted 8 quarters, or had employment in each of 8 quarters. Sorry, it may not have been the same employer. And the rest is spotty, and then a bunch here is missing. Then, of course, you start saying, well, why is it missing? Well, it could be missing for many reasons. It could be that they are not employed, or it could be they're working in Indiana, or it could be they've gone back into corrections, or it could be they're on welfare, or they could have gone into education. I need to match that data to understand what missingness is, right? And I can't ask them because it's administrative records. And so you need to be able to look at the actual data and codify the decisions that are being made in order to be able to share the information. There are thousands of decisions that get made in that measurement process, and people need to see what you've done. So why do I have Linnaeus up here? Other than that, I'm a proud half Swede. Well, because if you think about measurement, obviously, that's what he did. He started to do measurement and bucket things. And what you want to do is you want to go and look at what did he actually look at when he was creating his buckets, when he was doing his measurement. I want to look at the source. And what I'm trying to argue here is that's what we need to be thinking about. And there's lots of privacy issues associated. You know, obviously he's looking at a plant. I want to look at the individual people level records so that when I'm thinking about measurement, I can see how other people bucket it. Does that make sense? And how other people were thinking about it. So, and data sets are not well-defined entities in this world. This is relatively simple because it's administrative data. It's not sensor data or retail scanner data or so on. So this has kind of units. This is human services data, but it's still, as my Uncle John would say, a right mess, right? And people are going to pull from it in different ways, construct meshes in different ways, and so on. Linkages can be wrong. How many of you in this room get mail to only one name? How many of you get mail to 20 different names? I have a pretty easy name, Julia Lane. You wouldn't believe how many different versions and butcherings they can do about it. And of course, you want to have people looking at those linkages and thinking about, you know, are those algorithms wrong? I don't want to have a corporate entity coming in and making those linkages and saying, oh, it's all right, I made those linkages, without thinking about, you know, what precision recall trade-off was being made and just say, oh, here's your links. Because you can have different loss functions associated with that. And the cleaning of the data prior to doing the linkages is a hell of a lot of work because you have to standardize, and I don't need to spell that out for you. And measures need to be generated to some extent through trial and error. You know, you've seen this, how GitHub and so on share information. Here's an example that Bob Gerger and Emily Wiegand did with the corrections data. So let me give you another real-world example. So in corrections, one of the things the director of the corrections was interested in is the impact of technical violations on recidivism. So technical violations are something that, oh, you didn't report to parole every week. And if you have a technical violation, you're back in jail. So that creates lots of cost to the individual, because then, of course, they can't work. It shows up on their record. They could lose their job because they can't show up to work, and it costs the state. And so what he wanted to do was to see what is the effect of technical violations, or what's the relationship, not a causal, what's the relationship between technical violations and recidivism. And so what Bob and Emily did with working with people in the classes was they started to try and bucket them. So they took this individual level data and they started to describe and created categories, and then looked at the different categories and then looked at their earnings and then said, you know, if you take a look at this, the technical violations, the people who had very low technical violations were able to find employment. It's not causal, but it's an initial set of things. So the point is they spend a lot of time working with the microdata to generate measures. They weren't generated by a survey statistician and handed to him. So the issue is to work with that. I don't need to tell you this. Almost all social and economic activity is highly skewed. So, you know, most healthcare costs are from a small proportion of the population. Most businesses don't grow very fast. There are a few businesses that grow quickly, and so on. There's a few people who commit most of the crimes. So looking at the outliers is actually where most of the policy issues are. So, our challenge here is the core thing is that the more I work with the data, the greater the utility of the analysis. But obviously, and this is George Duncan and Steve Feinberg's picture, I forgot to quote the source, the greater the risk of the disclosure. And part of the challenge that we're facing is that trade-off is getting worse and worse. So one of the things that would be very helpful for you guys to be thinking about as you're thinking about privacy is it's not a one-dimensional thing. We should also be thinking about what is the utility trade-off that's associated with that. So how do we think about utility? Timeliness is super important if you're trying to implement policy. I don't want that kid to be dead, right? Accuracy is obviously one measure. Coverage, geographic detail, consistency, and then the number of ways in which it can be used. Okay? So I won't go into that in too much detail because I'm going to run out of time. And then what are the risks? So obviously, re-identification is going to be related to how noisy the linkages might be, whether you've got a sample versus a census. There are very different re-identification probabilities if I've got a small sample versus all the people in the population. Are we thinking about individual harm? And you've been talking a little bit about that here. And then not all items are the same. Like, do I care if they find out that I'm a female? Do I care if they find out that I'm an ex-murderer? Probably. And they might care about finding out if I'm a female if I'm actually transgender and I'm living in a neighborhood in which it might be a problem. But there's the contextual stuff, right? So, and here's my concern, is that while you have a very useful and important research agenda, it is having an impact on the quality of data that is being produced, and consequently, potentially the impact on the value of that data for decision making. And in fact, you had Steve Ruggles here. I know that Census Bureau people have been here. And Steve has probably put it more forcefully than most. But a very large portion of the policy community is deeply concerned about the way in which a research agenda is being operationalized without thinking about the impact on policy and utility. Right? Yeah.
So I understand that the census, I am far from an expert in the census, but I do know that it's used to apportion representation. And at that scale, I'm curious how much noise we need to add and how problematic that is. I understand that like lots of things one does with the census is like at a much more refined scale, but like knowing how many people live in a 100 square mile radius.
We should probably have that conversation offline, because that might take a very long time to discuss.
So I understand there's a constitutional thing that has to do with specifically apportioning votes, which might be like a different problem than a lot of the other things.
Just maybe one brief point that is salient here is that there's the decennial census, which is where people live and stuff.
Yeah.
And then there are the much more detailed
American
surveys like the ACS, and the sort of complexity of the issues are sort of very different.
Yes,
so that in many ways, the decennial census is sort of the easy.
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And that's exactly right, Adam. There are many problems. The challenge that I think is being transmitted is that differential privacy is going to be a silver bullet that solves all problems for all agencies and all, and that is certainly the message that is being heard in the policy community. And so I think better communication and a better understanding of for what purposes the types of approaches that are currently being used versus, the potential is an important one. And kind of getting you to think about other use cases is important. Helen.
This is a little bit, just to put this question out there without necessarily addressing it, but the two cases that really struck me felt very different in relation to this part of your discussion. The one about child welfare, there should be no obfuscation. Like, we need to know which child it is so that we can. But then the one about, let's say, recidivism, employment and so forth, it may be that in that case we want some policy to come out of statistical knowledge, and so it's like how much money should be spent to retrain, or that kind of issue, which doesn't require going back to the individuals that are. So it feels that those two are different.
No, they're not. And I'll talk about, I'm glad that you brought that up because I think the next couple of slides will make that clear. But yeah, there's a difference between policy analysis and case management. So the case management, I need to know who the kid is and get some information out. But I'll give you an example of kind of the hybrid approach in just a second, which actually comes out of the Allegheny County example with which I'm reasonably familiar. And then my point on the development of statistics to inform policy is that there's a lot of eyes that need to be on the development of those statistics prior to them being generated. Yeah.
I just want to flag kind of the broad politics issue. And I just want to, in three different dimensions. One is, I think normally the assumption is that if we do research and we get some interesting findings, that there will be action that happens. And that many of the issues that plague, whether it's people who've had interactions with the criminal justice system or kids in foster care or who are having interactions, we have all the research we need at this point to address 85% of the problem. We just have no political will, right? And that would be, this is a position I'm putting out there.
Yeah,
And can I just want to the second is that, this, in the US in particular, there's a specific reason that Paul Ryan was advancing evidence-based policy, and is partly tied to the Data Quality Act and a whole host of things because we lack a precautionary principle, right? And so there's a very conservative agenda around driving, and I'm obviously not at all opposed to evidence-based policy making. It's just in the US, it's part of a gnarly set of things that are designed to make it actually more difficult for administrative agencies in particular to do things that protect the public. Correct. When we're not clear about the risk, right? And so
I was not pushing the federal agenda.
No,
I was pushing the state and local who are at the coalface, who are trying actually to develop measures.
Totally, and I just want to put the politics on this. And then the last bit is, it's been super interesting to me, as you know, at the state and local level, which is what you're talking about, there's actually been kind of, I think, a real, and part of it is about Code for America, and part of it is about kind of a lot of things that happened during the Obama administration that really helped develop a more robust understanding of what data can do for good. But when we saw Trump come in and a different immigration policy, you saw all of those same agencies going, holy crap, we have to get rid of all this data. And it was, the sanctuary city policies, most of those are about, we need to be able to allow people to say that they are part of our community but not actually retain any data about them. We need to allow people to present themselves for services without collecting any data about them. And so the politics of this is so important from my perspective. And I totally agree that we need data to make good choices. But I think that the assumption that privacy is like anti-utility, which is often how it's presented in differential privacy generally, but also in conversations about research, is and action is just, it kind of, for me, always misses the nuance of the conversation, because data and evidence are just like, it's a political act, the whole thing. And so and this isn't to take away from the importance of all of this work at all. It's just like, I want to remind everybody that there's this broad political apparatus in which these conversations occur.
Correct.
Yeah.
No question.
Yeah.
Yeah, as usual, you put it perfectly. So, yeah, I'm not going to expand on that. You made the point. Good.
And this was a friendly intervention.
No. And so taken.
Good.
So I want to comment on this and things that you said that, you know, decisions on privacy are taken without taking policy issues in account, without thinking about policy. I think that was a bit too harsh. I think all this community, and we work with the Census, we know that a lot of issues are taken together into account in the decisions that they are making. It's not that they are ignoring Steve Ruggles or anybody else.
I'm just saying that there were two sides. I was putting both of them up there.
The second thing is that I think our role as technologists, as people who study privacy from a mathematical point of view, is to understand the real trade-off between the utility and privacy, as you put it. And this is what we can supply policymakers with. Now you would make a decision. It seems that to a large extent what Ruggles is asking for is contradictory to our current understanding of privacy. And one cannot have both, in a sense, and you will have to make a decision on this balance. And a third comment is that privacy is an overloaded term, and differential privacy does not apply necessarily in all, it does not apply in all places where we use the word privacy. And one thing I would ask from you is to look at these cases and ask exactly what is the privacy desiderata that you believe is relevant for that story, for that use case. And we'll take that, try to formalize it mathematically, and tell you to what extent it is agreeing or disagreeing with the utility that you're trying to get from it.
I've got a desiderata at the end, and that's exactly what I'm hoping, why I was so delighted and honored to be able to come and talk to you guys, because I think the conversation has been muddled, and I'd really, I think clarifying the enormous contribution that can be made would be extremely helpful, and calm many of the concerns that are being raised. I think it's fair to say that the level of alarm is very high because of the, well, I'm not going to assign reasons, but it is very high. So let me just talk through what in some of the issues that are being raised, and then at the end I'll talk through the desiderata. One of the issues is, of course, how do you measure privacy and utility? That was kind of the discussion that Frauke, many of you were at that workshop, and very grateful for your input on that. So, going back to the Allegheny County case, the reason I know about this is it was Kiwis who are involved in the example. I forget who talked about it the other day. It was you.
No, sorry, I was giving you a
4 minutes. Okay, it wasn't you did it. Okay, so going back to the child abuse thing. So you're going to think my entire family is economists, but my brother-in-law was involved in this. But here was basically the idea. So you asked about the prediction. So essentially what they do is they look at the kids and they put them in buckets. So they say, here's your risk. You know, people call up and they say the kid next door is getting hit, and you know, you want to know about the other ways. But you know, what they'll do is they put these into buckets, and this would be a very high risk kid. So the kid who they've integrated the data across Allegheny County. So the kid whose picture I showed earlier, that would have shown off as a high risk individual. So when the caseworker, they use their own judgment, but then they also get an indicator of the risk that that kid is in using data to figure out what's going on. And when you think about so there was an impact evaluation of this approach. It was done at Stanford. The results came out May 1st. And so it was an impartial evaluation, and it actually reduced racial disparities, improved the accuracy of maltreatment screening, and that was, so going back to, there are many areas, your point is well taken on immigration, but there are many areas in which this information can really help. So, you know, trying to think about how you could build a data infrastructure that incorporates privacy and confidentiality into the core of the decision making is kind of part of the desiderata here. This is not being able to pull people like you into a major research infrastructure effort. You know, we see it in many other areas. Alex Zillay, you know, the Sky server in astrophysics has spun off massive research interest. And going in, my daughter, who is also an economist, my husband, daughter, my cousin is the finance editor for the London Economist. We breed, you see. She refers to going to the BEA as a dungeon. And she sits there, she does her work all by herself, no one to talk to, no one to compare. I'm very confident, of course, that her work is high quality, of course, but it does worry me that most of the people who are doing the work on confidential microdata and RDCs are graduate students. And so part of what we built was a virtual RDC in which the data user is collaborating, working with Brian Granger at Jupyter Notebook and Fernando Perez, who you all know here at Berkeley, to build that collaboration. But access sits at the core. So kind of as part of this data infrastructure, and again, stealing from Charlie Catlett, building not standalone hidden data, but an infrastructure where you can search and discover and find out what other work people have done, what measures have been used, what linkage decisions have been made, because we don't have the federal statistical system doing it. You've got people working in teams with different understandings who need to collaborate. And that's kind of the genius of Amazon, which has done it in the private sector. I'd like to see that in the public sector. So that data discovery, and I'm conscious of the time, we want, when people are looking at publications, to know what data sets are available. So that's part of Schmidt Futures funding. What data sets were used in this paper? Who are the experts? What code books, what annotations have been used to build a coral reef of knowledge. And that's not a set of one-offs. That is repeated building of an infrastructure. So what I'd really like to see in an infrastructure is an integration of these approaches. That's my call to some extent. In a pathetic attempt to increase the readership of our book, we actually did the work on this, but this is I'd like inference and privacy and confidentiality as part of every policy class that uses data and every data science class that uses real data, because people need to be working on this. So I'd like you to be, and your point is well taken, but at least think about that in concrete terms as you're thinking about how the data are being used. So here it is. So here are the kinds of things, and this is a first set of requests, and there would be many more, I'm sure, if we get these conversations going. So maybe think about use cases more general than the Census Bureau, the state and local. We talk about what is reasonable means. What does it mean to say what's reasonable means? Different measures of risk based on access descriptions. So Kobe asked, what are the restrictions? Well, in some sense, it's not 0-1. If you only allow access to approved, trusted researchers in a safe setting where they've signed an NDA not to re-identify and so on, you might have a different set of criteria than if it's out in the wild versus never released. And think about, let's think about approaches that we can generate summary information that, like that bucket score, the 20-1, that provides information that has value to decision makers. So you're not re-identifying the individual kid, but you're saying, we've got to worry about this one. Don't think about all observations equally. We can be looking at subsets of data. Think about the measures of utility, and I know you're thinking about this, but I think this is a very hard problem. It's very hard. There are complicated variable structures that might need to be addressed. Don't treat all fields equally, and think about access and measurement. And the more people we have think about measurement, the better off we are. So, am I on time? Couple of minutes over. So thank you very much. And my apologies, I have a plane to catch because I have to teach tomorrow morning. So I'll be leaving at around 10:45 to catch my flight that leaves at 10:30. At 12:30, sorry. The time zone differences kill you.
All right, so you'll only be here for the first 20 minutes of this.
Yes, but I've got you on video.
Great. Adam has a comment.
And
There's a mic for you, Adam, I believe.
oh yeah, sorry about that.
No, you keep yours and you can use the handhelds. That way you can respond to questions. Great.
Yeah, let's see if
I'll
I
take
can,
this
I'll
off.
see if I can use the projector. But if it doesn't work, that's fine.
You're good.
You keep yours.
I will keep it, I just need to turn it off. There we go.
Let's see. So thank you, Julia, for the talk and for raising a bunch of really crucial issues. So I just want to.
You because I changed some of the
No, I mean only the title changed, which I wasn't gonna go near. Was it ever great? Okay. Anyway, so just to reinforce some points that came up. Utility has many facets, of course, and something that we in the kind of more computer sciencey community tend to think a lot about sort of numerical measures of utility or like various kind of quantitative measures of utility, but we don't necessarily think about things like, well, what's the cost in terms of timeliness, what's the cost in terms of ease of use. I mean, we think about these things at some level, we understand that they're there, but making them more salient is sort of never a bad thing. At least at some point in the spectrum between kind of the pure research end of things and actually getting things that change the world in real life. Julia made an excellent case that thinking of the census or the other big use cases we tend to play with like Apple and Google, that's great, but there's there are all these other places where data and measurement matter and people need to make decisions and thinking about these sort of broader applications again brings up things that are maybe not as salient when you're looking at sort of super well curated data. And a point that came up over and over was sort of the question of access, and there were just many aspects of it, and I wanted to unpack a few quickly. So one is that one of the things that came up a lot in the talk is that you need ways to actually see the data that matter at the time they matter. And that broadly is what computer scientists would call access control. And that is, that's not an easy problem, but conceptually it's a very different problem from the kinds of disclosure control problems that have been some of the topics for this workshop and this semester. And it's an interesting question to think about, whether or not that conceptual division is perhaps oversimplifying the relationship between these issues. So just, case in point, if I think about linked data that are linked across agencies, when we merge and link data, what rules should be applying to these sort of linked data sets? And also, what problems and new pathologies arise because we've concentrated data in these, and concentrated access to data, right? So on one hand, this is important. The child abuse case is a fantastic example of how you need information to get to where it needs to go. But of course, concentration of data is in some sense concentration of power, and what comes with that. Yet another kind of access, aspect of this, which Julie was sort of talking about at the end with RDCs, is that we need sort of better approaches to letting people work directly with data and yet having rigorous ways to talk about what they, to release the results of those analyses. And this is sort of, I'm not going to dwell on it just because Cynthia and John wrote a paper about this recently and it came up in various talks so far this semester, but they dubbed this the Feinberg Problem because Steve Feinberg would often hammer this point home in his own very forceful way. And but it's an absent Steve to do it, it's a good thing to remind us about. And I'll just a quick point. Steve was one of the original organizers of this program, and so we miss him very much. And one of the things that computer scientists struggle with is that the things we do with data, and this came up again in Julia's talk, aren't well-defined processes. Because it's not a well-defined algorithmic pipeline. It's very hard to reason about rigorously. So just finding better ways to do that is important. Just so quickly, some related research problems. Dealing with small samples, that matters, that came up. Julia was talking about outliers and how much they matter. And the problems of doing things with outliers and disclosure control technically involves a lot of the same problems as dealing with small samples. So outliers are sort of troublesome statistically. It's hard to understand how much statistical power you're really getting because they could be just noisy things. On the other hand, they're sort of crucial for our understanding about the problem. Like we get a lot, like just as humans, we get in a data analysis task, we get a lot out of looking at the things that don't fit our current model and just thinking about them. Right? We need refined notions of statistical utility. I kind of talked about that earlier. So I was typing these notes as we were going, so they're a little disorganized. And then better tools to incorporate data uncertainty in our reasoning about confidentiality and disclosure control. Data are messy, they're noisy, they're sampled. We have some tools for thinking about this, for like when we really understand sampling distributions well, for example. And there are a number of papers that are sort of trying to incorporate various measures of data uncertainty, but they're hard to apply for reasons that I won't go into. And then another research sort of area that I think is interesting is, how, and I mentioned this in my Unbaked Ideas talk earlier on Monday, was like, how do we collectively decide how to use the data we have? Okay, so one thing that I think has not been well digested by communities, a lot of communities, is that you can't do everything you can't release everything you'd ever want to know about a data set without basically releasing the raw data. So there are trade-offs that come. Right now, we don't even understand what trade-offs the Census has been implementing because we don't understand how much noise there is in the things they release. But how do we kind of collectively, as research communities, make these decisions?
Can you just,
Yep.
for my curiosity, tell me what is the pufferfish coupled world approach?
I can give you citations. I can give you pointers offline. I'll just go through quickly. So just some last points that I wanted to bring up. Access control versus disclosure control. We need better language for that. And outside of computer science, that language has to be understood more carefully, because I think these problems are often confused. Another point to remember is that even traditional disclosure control is like by no means necessarily operating at a very good point on the trade-off between utility and error. And speaking of the kind of current controversy over the census's decisions, there's sort of this assumption that when the census publishes things that look like microdata, those can be taken as real data. But they're not, and they shouldn't. And of course, just again, something to remember is that when we, all these huge amounts of data we have, they bring with them new pathologies. And so, I liked the word humility on that evidence-based policy making report. Computer scientists may need a dose of humility occasionally too, but I prefer it when it's other.
Don't at all.
But I prefer it when it's other people. All right. Anyway, and maybe one last point is that underlying a lot of what's going on is that we want processes that automate all these decisions about getting information one place or another, making it easy to release information. All those types of decisions, anything you automate, you are you are formalizing the problem, whether you think of your task that way or not, right? Because once you build a system that does something automatically, you have built a mathematical model for your problem. So if you think about it that way, you'll probably make better systems than if you if you kind of somehow think that like you don't really need to reason formally.
So
And I'll stop with that. Okay.
Thank you very much.
And I don't know if Julia has time to add anything, but.